I want to take you to this quote from Hage. Read it slowly and carefully. And here, but I just want you to remember, I'm not interested in scoring. I'm not interested in saying, look at the baddie, the serpent's egg is there. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is nationalism for you. This is any nationalism. This is a very interesting quote historically, because when Hage wrote this, straight after, he was asking the question, where shall we go to have an Israeli state? He was not sure it's Palestine. He was sort of like thinking maybe in Latin America somewhere. So don't rush into thinking he's thinking of the Palestinians as the ones he wants to round up. He does not know who he's thinking about. What is interesting about this quote, and what is interesting at this period of Zionism, is that Zionists here are practical, theoretical nationalists. That is, they are not theoreticians of the nation like other theoreticians of the nation at that time who were just sitting, engaging in lovely theorizing of the nation. They wanted, the Zionists were not interested in just theorizing. They wanted a practical outcome, a nation. But what's interesting at the same time is that at that specific period, the nation itself was not concrete. So it's the concrete, abstract thought. And it interests me, this concrete, abstract thought, because it allows me to ask the question, why would someone about to imagine a nation thinks about rounding up and blowing up bears, beasts? What is it about the nationalist imaginary which makes anyone who dreams about a nation, as I say, not Zionist, anyone who dreams about a nation, say, okay, so how am I going to get rid of the wolves, the beasts? What are these beasts? To me, and this is sort of like a conclusion I have got to after reading many nationalists, not just Zionists. The idea is that nationalism is inherently politicidal. Politicidal. I'm using the term politicide from the work of the Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmeling. The notion of politicide is the notion of killing the political will of. When you politicize people, it is not about genocide, it is not about ethnocide, it's simply about killing the political will of a group. And to my mind, the beast is always not the presence of the group, but a will that can be hostile to your will within the nation. It is that hostile will of the other that might stop you from feeling at home in your nation state. And you want to eradicate it. In this sense, I'm saying all nationalisms are inherently politicidal. They cannot allow a political will other than the national will exist with. They need to eradicate it. These are the beasts. that nationalists have to always eradicate. So in a sense, nationalism is always narcissistic, and I'm coming slowly to the theme of narcissism here. Nationalism is always narcissistic in the sense of it always involving a cutting of a relation with the other. Me. How am I going to be at home? Me. I will come to this a bit more. So to my mind, this me modality of thinking that is part of nationalism became part of colonialism too. But also it became part of anti-colonialism. I think one of the biggest failures of colonial cultures, to my mind, is not just the failure of colonial projects. It is the failure of anti-colonial projects. It is the incredible array of countries that have popped out in the struggle against colonialism and ended up being such majestic flops. How can one look at any place you choose? Algeria comes to mind, thinking about Middle East. Think about Algerian struggle against French colonialism. And think, well, I mean, to say that there are people in Algeria today who realistically ask the question, would we have been historically better off not to have engaged in anti-colonial struggle? I mean, I'm not answering, and I wouldn't want to answer yes, of course. But I think the fact that genuine nationalists have come to the point where they can ask this question must tell us something about the limitations of a history of anti-colonialism. What is this history of anti-colonialism? It's a history which says, I'm a victim. I have been oppressed. I have been disempowered. And the aim is for me to re-empower myself again. The aim is me. The aim is me. I was disempowered. I want to become empowered again. I was weak. I want to become strong. I call it narcissism because I would like to think that for better or worse, colonialism is a relation. And colonialism is a bad relation. I would have liked anti-colonialism to be something like making a bad relation a good relation. Not about making disempowered people powerful. I think this logic is alive in Australia in the kind of anti-racism that is propagated as a form of empowerment. People who are subjected to racism have been thumped. It's in the logic of sexism or anti-sexism. Women have been thumped, and the aim is to empower. The notion of empowering the disempowered is alive and well everywhere you look at those struggles. And to me, it's inherently narcissistic in the sense that it avoids the relation. It avoids the relational world. it avoids saying, I see it with some Lebanese kids in Sydney who feel, rightly, that they have been subjected to all kinds of racism, disempowerment, rightly. But their logic is, well, me. It's not that I have to commit myself to a better relation with Anglo-Australia or with whatever Australia or with others. What is important is that I'm not going to be messed with again, mate. I'm not going to let a situation happen where I am not in control of myself. This is the anti-racism which has its lineage in nationalism and nationalist narcissism. And it seems to me that it is incredibly at play in Israel today and in Palestine. Israeli nationalism is an incredible hybrid of both colonial nationalism and anti-colonial nationalism, of colonial narcissism and anti-colonial narcissism. I don't think that Zionism is equal to colonialism, by the way. I don't think in the sense of Zionism is a colonial project. I think Zionism itself did not have colonial dreaming in it, even though I would think that Zionism and Zionist dreaming would have been impossible to come about as a reality without the mechanics of colonialism. It is an ideology which has come into being through a colonial mechanics, but it's not inherently itself colonial. It did not have fantasies of colonizing people or fantasies of supremacy of a people like colonial ideologies. Zionism, as I said, it's I want to be at home in the space. That's it. But I can tell you the idea, and I think I know empirically the history of Zionist settlement very well. And I know that it's not just out of scratch, and I know there's a lot of Jewish people who lived in Palestine, etc. I know the numbers. I know the people who pump them up each way to suit their purposes. I know all this. But I still would say that it's one thing to start making yourself believe credibly that you're going to have a nation state, not nation, a nation state, where you ruled the realms 2,000 years ago. It's one thing to convince yourself, and another to bring such dreaming into a reality. The mechanics of power needed to bring such dream into reality is a colonial mechanics. Let's face it. Without the mechanics and politics of colonialism, Zionist dreaming would not have come into being as a nation state. But Zionism itself, as I said, does not inherently have a colonial dream. Both points are very important to remember, because now, as I said, now Zionism has carried, in this sense, the narcissism which is part of every nationalism, but also it has carried with it this anti-racist narcissism with a vengeance. I'm not going to be messed with again, mate. Maybe they didn't say mate, but they definitely said, I'm not going to be messed with again. I'm not going to be in a situation where I am made an object in the way the racists have made me. I'm going to have a space where I control my destiny, etc. These are all parts of anti-colonial dreamings. And so this is the interesting hybrid, narcissistic hybrid that Zionism represents. And I think it is always interesting how part of such narcissistic dreamings become fantasies of omnipotence. This is a well-known psychoanalytic fact, that link between narcissistic fantasies and fantasies of omnipotence. Fantasies that I will be all-powerful. I am not going to be weak, I'm going to be all-powerful. To my mind, the history of this fantasy of omnipotence in Israel has been quite crucial. And again, it is a historical thing, because no people have ever come close to a kind of like caressing their fantasy of omnipotence as much as the Israelis have. I think no one comes close to think that omnipotence is possible. They keep thinking of it as something which can happen somewhere in the future. But Israel had a taste of omnipotence in 1967. In 1967 war, there was a kind of sense that omnipotence is not just a fantasy, it's actually a possibility. And to my mind, this has become part of the way Israeli governments legitimize themselves to their population. People started believing that this is the function of Israel. I am here because the government is going to give me omnipotence, is going. Now, omnipotence, politicized, means an inability to live with another that constitutes even a minimum of danger to me. I just cannot accept. I am an Australian. I have to live with fantasies that I have, that China can constitute a danger, that Indonesia can constitute a danger, whatever. I was going to say New Zealand, but I forgot. And I can live with that. With this, I adapt to dangers. I don't say, I will not rest. I am not going to rest until I know, I look at China and no danger emanates from China towards me. Then I will feel good. I'm not going to say, I cannot rest unless I make sure no danger from Indonesia is going to come. I live with the danger, which might be true danger, might be not. It's me who is imagining the possibility. It's the uncertainty of the other. That's what we call the uncertainty of the other. Can I live with the uncertainty of the other? And narcissism is precisely this inability to live with the uncertainty of the other. The other has to be made secure. I cannot accept even a modicum of danger emanating. Now, let me give you some quotes of how these fantasies started coming out during the Gaza war. First, look at the language of power emanating from the Israeli state. I want to hear what they say. Wiping Hamas. The idea of wiping Hamas out. Now, you might hear it. Let me tell you, you might read it and think not much of it. But the idea is that someone can come and say, our objective is to wipe Hamas out. Wipe Hamas out. I mean, what kind of imagination produces a language like wiping out the other? In Israeli means the task is smashing Hamas. Notice, you will not be able, you will not get, and that is simply a question of sense of power. I will be talking a lot about this sense of power and what's left for me here in time. But Nietzsche tells us that it is important to differentiate between what he calls will to power and sense of power. To him, the notion of sense of power is very crucial, because sense of power is my subjectivity of the power that I have. It is an evaluation of my power. And it's not an objective evaluation. So I can feel my power is rising. I can have an amount of power X, and I feel my power is rising. So Nietzsche says, I deploy power magnanimously, because this little thing is annoying me, and I feel, even though it's annoying me, but I'm becoming even more powerful. So, okay, I'll be magnanimous. But I can have the same amount of power, and I feel that my power is declining. My sense of power and how I deploy power becomes different. So it's not the amount of power that I have which will make a difference into how I deal with things that irritate me. It is my sense of power. Do I feel my power secure, insecure? Do I feel it's rising, it's declining? All of these issues. And it seems to me that there is a serious crisis because of this fantasy of omnipotence that is, by the way, it is part of the legitimacy of modes of legitimizing the Israeli state. It's not that, as I said, it's not that, for instance, Netanyahu thinks, I'm going to become omnipotent again. It's a question of there is a lot of people who have put their trust in Netanyahu in making sure that Israel becomes omnipotent again. And the political game for Netanyahu is, how am I going, basically, to pull this? How am I going to pull this off? Making people think, yes, Israel is going to be so unbelievably secure for you, blah, blah, blah. Again, we are going to, I've noticed I'm running out of time, but I have all these quotes about how each person like Barak represented how fantasies of 67 are replayed constantly in the invasion of Gaza. A crisis of omnipotence because partly of what happened, of course, in South Lebanon. What happened in South Lebanon and what a lot of, again, the discourse about regaining the Israeli deterrence capacity. If you go through the literature in debate, you say, how is Israel going to regain its deterrent capacity? That's so sort of like people will say, this guy from National Security, they said there has been a nagging sense of uncertainty in the last couple of years of whether anyone is really afraid of Israel anymore. I said, the idea is that how can we exist if they are not afraid of us? That we've lost this capacity to scare them. The state of Israel throughout that crisis tries to vie for normality. You hear a lot. Would any normal state accept having this kind of stuff on its border? The talk of normality is constantly introduced. Would any of you, as if, and it's now, this is the pathology, because when what should go without saying does not go without saying, you know that it doesn't go without saying. When say, you should recognize Israel as a Jewish state. I mean, who seriously believes that if someone comes and says, okay, we recognize Israel as a Jewish state, this is it. Problems have been bloody solved. The idea, of course, is that, I mean, there are people, there are countries which have dispossessed others. They don't go around asking them to recognize them. I don't see the Australian state going and saying to the indigenous people, recognize that we exist. We're not going to do anything or solve any of your health problems until you recognize that we exist. No more indigenous policy until you recognize that Australia exists. It goes without saying that Australia exists. It goes without saying. And it seems to me the tragedy of the Israeli state is that its existence does not go without saying. It has, this is what I mean by its impossibility, it has reached its limit as a modality of becoming a nation state. And it's not anybody's fault. It's not anybody's fault. You can do historically a study and say maybe the implementation of the project started a bit too late in the history of nation states for it to become a nation state. You might say it's done in a bad region, for God's sake. Why couldn't you find somewhere where there's less Arabs around you, or you could have caused yourself less problems, or you could argue many things about why this project has reached the end. But, of course, as I said, that's, I have to finish. My point is not just that the Israelis are in a dead end. My point is that the Palestinians also, just as much as the Israelis embody today the dead end of the national project, the Palestinians embody the dead end of the anti-colonial project as it has been perceived and as it has been dreamt as a narcissistic attempt to regain power, as the idea of we need a nation in order to feel good again. Who bloody needs another nation in the Middle East? I'm not sure. Why the hell do we need another nation in the Middle East? You will need to convince me. I mean, and so two narcissisms are not going to take us anywhere. And that's where I feel that the job of intellectuals is to think from somewhere else. Start thinking. But we are talking about seriously radicalizing or thinking about the whole nation-state regime. What does it mean? Can we think outside it? I know that the nation-state has been fantastic and has done a lot of good things. I'm not being ironic. I accept the argument. But I also accept an empirical reality that there are many places where it has reached its limits. And we have to think beyond it. And to me, what is important is the relational imperative. The relational imperative. That is, how do you make bad relations good relations? I look at Israel, Palestine, I say, this is a group of Israelis having a bad relation with a group of Palestinians. I am no longer interested in helping either the Israelis or the Palestinians feel secure or feel empowered or fight anti-colonialism. I am happy to live with the fact that they are stuck with each other. And how can we make a bad relation a good relation? Thinking relationally, not thinking in terms of entities. I could give you a few ideas of where to go, but I've run out of time, and I think it's different. But I hope I've given you a critique and an orientation for those who want to think about it. Thank you.